For 7 nights, the orphanage stood silent beneath the moon, its windows dark, its halls asleep, its prayers whispered instead of spoken aloud. And for 7 nights, something watched it. No footsteps, no shadows crossing the yard, no signs of forced entry. Just a feeling, deep, suffocating, undeniable, that the darkness itself had learned the building's name. The children felt it first. They woke at the same hour every night, breath caught in their throats, hearts racing for reasons they could not explain. They dreamed of eyes without faces, of silence that leaned too close, of a presence that did not rush, because it did not need to. Caretakers blamed the cold, the wind, old pipes groaning in the walls. But the 7th night was different, because the watching stopped. And when something that ancient stops watching, it means it has decided. On the 8th night, the door did not creak. The locks did not break. No alarm sounded. Dracula did not stalk the orphanage anymore. He entered it. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our cinematic stories of suspense and horror. The orphanage had learned the sound of night long before it learned fear. It was an old building on the edge of town, where the road thinned into trees and the wind carried stories no one wanted to hear. Its walls were thick, its windows narrow, built in a time when protection meant stone and silence. Children slept there by routine, not comfort. They learned early that crying did not always bring help, and that quiet was safer. On the first night, nothing happened. At least, nothing anyone could prove. The watchman made his rounds as usual, lanterns swaying, boots echoing softly across the courtyard. The gates were locked. The doors were barred. The moon hung low and pale, washing the building in colorless light. Somewhere in the trees, an owl called, but inside, 6 children woke at exactly the same moment. None of them screamed. They sat up in their beds, hearts racing, breath shallow, eyes drawn toward the windows without knowing why. For a few seconds they listened to the walls, to the halls, to the space between sounds. Then the feeling passed. They lay back down, confused, embarrassed by their own fear. By morning, they could not explain what had woken them. The second night, the feeling returned, stronger. Not fear exactly. Pressure, as if the air itself had leaned closer. A little boy named Elias pressed his forehead against the glass of his window, staring into the yard. He thought he saw movement near the tree line, something tall, perfectly still. When he blinked, it was gone. The caretakers dismissed it. Nightmares, they said. The cold does strange things. The third night, the dog stopped barking. That alone should have been enough. The mutts that slept near the gates were loud, territorial, sensitive to anything that moved. But when the moon rose on the third night, they curled up and whined, tails tucked, refusing to look toward the trees. Inside, the children woke again, more of them this time. 10, 12. Some cried softly into their pillows. Others stared at the ceiling, counting cracks. One girl whispered a prayer she barely remembered. No one saw a face, but everyone felt watched. On the fourth night, the watchman paused mid-step in the courtyard. His lantern flickered, flames shrinking for no reason. The wind died suddenly, leaving the yard unnaturally still. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness. "Hello," he called. Nothing answered. Still, he could not shake the certainty that he was no longer alone. He hurried back inside, embarrassed by his own fear, never realizing that the darkness had leaned back only because it finished measuring him. By the fifth night, sleep became fragile. The children fought it, knowing, somehow, that waking was worse. Dreams blurred into waking moments. Hallways seemed longer. Shadows stretched farther than the light allowed. One child swore the walls were breathing. Another said the building felt to wear. That night, a caretaker found small marks in the frost near the trees. Not footprints, not claws, just impressions, as if the ground itself had been pressed down by something that had stood there for a long time without moving. They melted by morning. On the sixth night, the watching became deliberate. Every window facing the yard felt heavy, as if something beyond the glass had memorized their positions. Curtains were drawn tighter. Candles were lit in hallways long abandoned after dark. The children woke again, every single one this time. None of them spoke. They sat up in their beds together, dozens of small figures frozen in silence, listening to something that did not make a sound, something patient, something old. On the seventh night, the watching stopped. No pressure, no waking, no sense of eyes in the dark. The dogs barked again. The wind returned. The building sighed with relief it did not understand. The caretaker smiled, convinced the fear had passed. But fear does not vanish when it is finished watching. It vanishes when it is chosen. Beyond the trees, where the moonlight could not reach, Dracula stepped away from shadows. He had counted the windows, measured the walls, listened to the heartbeats inside. 7 nights were enough. On the 8th night, he would no longer watch the orphanage. He would enter it. The 8th night arrived without ceremony. No storm announced it. No omen scratched at the sky. The orphanage settled into sleep the way it always did. Lamps dimmed, doors bolted, prayers whispered by caretakers who did not know what they were protecting against. The children sensed it anyway. They had learned the rhythm of fear over the past 7 nights, learned how it crept instead of rushed. And when the pressure returned, soft but unmistakable, they understood something important. This time it was closer. Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting his breaths. The air felt heavier than it should have, thick in his lungs. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard creaked. Not the casual complaint of old wood, but a careful sound, measured, controlled. Someone was moving through the building. Sister Agnes paused mid-step at the end of the corridor, lantern raised. She had cared for this place for 30 years. She knew every sound it made. The orphanage spoke to her through groans and echoes, through the language of age. This sound did not belong. She frowned, heart quickening, and took a cautious step forward. The lantern flame flickered, not violently, not enough to go out, just enough to bow. At the front entrance, the locks remained untouched. That was the strangest part. No scrape of metal, no crack of wood, no forced entry. Yet the door was open, only an inch, but enough. Cold air slid across the floor like a living thing, curling along the baseboards, climbing the walls. It carried no smell, no sound, just presence. Dracula stepped inside without hurry. The orphanage did not resist him. Its walls had been built to keep things out, but they had never been taught how to deny something that did not need permission. The shadows welcomed him instinctively, gathering at his feet, stretching toward him like servants recognizing their master. He paused just inside the door, listened. Heartbeats, dozens of them, small, uneven, afraid. Dracula closed his eyes. 7 nights of watching had given him more than knowledge of the building. They had given him understanding of the children inside, how fear moved through them, how silence settled deeper than sound. He moved, not through hallways, through space. Wherever shadows touched, he followed. In the girls' dormitory, Clara, older than most, sharper too, sat up suddenly. She had been dreaming of counting windows when the dream shattered like glass. She felt it, not evil. Focus. Her eyes moved to the doorway. The shadows are thickened, folding inward, as if the dark itself had learned how to stand. She clamped a hand over her mouth. Dracula did not enter the room. He stood just beyond the threshold, unseen by all but her. His eyes swept the beds, measuring breath, fear, potential. He was not hunting randomly. He was choosing. Down the hall, Sister Agnes reached the corner just in time to see the lantern flame die completely. Darkness swallowed the corridor, absolute and sudden. She froze. Her heart pounded, the sound impossibly loud in her ears. "Who's there?" she asked, voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. Silence answered. Then, from behind her, a whisper, not a word, not a sound, but the sense of being addressed. She turned. The hallway was empty, but the shadows had shifted. She backed away, breath coming fast, and fled toward the chapel, whispering prayers that tangled in her throat. She never saw the tall figure pass behind her, so close that the cold brushed her skin. Dracula ignored her. Adults were loud with fear, predictable. Their terror cluttered the night. Children were quieter, more honest. In the boys' dormitory, Elias felt the air change and sat up, eyes wide, his gaze locked onto the far corner of the room, where darkness pressed against darkness. Two red eyes opened. Elias did not scream. He could not. The eyes regarded him calmly, not cruelly, not kindly, curious, judging. Then they closed again, vanishing into the dark. Elias collapsed back onto his pillow, shaking, unsure whether he had imagined it. Dracula moved on. He passed room after room, bed after bed, never touching, never rushing. He listened to heartbeats the way others listen to music. Some were too fragile, some too loud, some burned too brightly, drawing attention he did not want. Near the center of the building, he stopped. One heartbeat stood apart from the others, not faster, not slower. Steadier, aware. Dracula smiled faintly. 7 nights of watching had led to this moment. And somewhere in the orphanage, a child opened their eyes, knowing, without knowing how, that the night had finally found them. The heartbeat that drew Dracula and did not race. That was what set it apart. Fear usually announced itself. Fluttering, stuttering, betraying the body's panic before the mind could catch up. But this heartbeat was measured, controlled, as if its owner had already accepted something the others had not. Dracula followed it through the corridors, his presence bending the dark around him. Candles guttered as he passed. The air cooled, settling into a silence so deep it felt deliberate. The child lay awake, not frozen, not pretending to sleep, waiting. The room was small, shared by 4 iron beds. 3 were occupied by children pulled tight into themselves, breaths shallow, fear leaking quietly into the night. The 4th bed, nearest the wall, held a boy named Thomas. Thomas stared at the ceiling, hands folded on his chest. When the shadows gathered at the foot of his bed, he did not flinch. Dracula paused. It had been many years since the child had done that. "You're not hiding," Dracula observed, his voice barely more than a suggestion of sound. Thomas turned his head slowly, eyes meeting the darkness without searching it. "I didn't know where to," he replied. The answer pleased Dracula more than it should have. He stepped forward, letting just enough of himself be seen, his height, his stillness, the suggestion of eyes reflecting a darker red than the night allowed. The other children in the room whimpered in their sleep. Thomas did not look away. "Do you know who I am?" Dracula asked. Thomas considered the question carefully. "You're the one who was watching," he said. "The others felt it. I heard them talk." Dracula inclined his head slightly. "And does that frighten you?" "Yes," Thomas said honestly. Then, after a pause, "But not the way it should." Dracula's smile was thin. "Why is that?" Thomas swallowed. His hands tightened briefly, then relaxed again. "Because you didn't rush," he said. "If you wanted to hurt us, you would have—" The logic was imperfect, but the instinct was sharp. Dracula moved closer, and to the edge of his shadow touched the boy's blanket. He could hear Thomas's breath now, steady despite the tremor beneath it. "Children usually beg," Dracula said, "or cry, or pretend I am not real." "I don't think pretending works," Thomas replied. Dracula laughed softly, an ancient sound that never reached his eyes. "No," he agreed, "it does not." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The orphanage breathed around them, with settling, distant winds pressing against old stone. Somewhere down the hall, a caretaker whispered a prayer, unaware how close it came to being answered by something other than God. "Why did you come?" Thomas asked finally. Dracula studied him. "Choice," he said, "and consequence." Thomas frowned. "Is that bad?" "Not always." Dracula crouched slightly, bringing his gaze closer to the boy's level. "Do you know why I watched this place for 7 nights?" Thomas shook his head. "To see who would break," Dracula said. "Who would scream, who would call out, and who didn't." Thomas asked quietly. Dracula's eyes darkened. "Exactly." The boy's breath caught, but he did not look away. "Does that mean I have to go with you?" Thomas asked. The question was not desperate. It was resigned. Dracula felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, an echo of a life long abandoned. "Not tonight," he said. Thomas blinked. Then why me? Dracula straightened. Because the night notices those who see it clearly, he replied. And because you'll remember this. I don't want to forget, Thomas said. Dracula considered that. Memory is heavier than fear, he warned. Are you prepared to carry it? Thomas nodded slowly. Someone has to. The shadows around the bed shifted, restless now. Dracula stood, withdrawing his presence inch by inch. Sleep, he instructed. When morning comes, you will wake. Nothing will be taken from you. Thomas hesitated. Will you come back? Dracula paused at the doorway. Yes, he said truthfully, but not as you expect. He vanished into the corridor, leaving the room unchanged, no marks, no broken locks, no proof. Only the lingering sense that something irrevocable had occurred. As Thomas closed his eyes, the orphanage seemed to lean closer to him, as if listening. And far above, beyond the reach of prayer or promise, Dracula moved through the dark with a single certainty settling into place. He had not come to feed. He had come to mark. And the night was not finished with a child who did not hide. Morning arrived gently, as if the sun itself were trying not to disturb what had happened. Light crept through the orphanage windows in thin, careful lines. Dust drifted in the air. The building looked the same as it always had. Old, tired, ordinary. But the night had left something behind. The children felt it first. They woke quieter than usual. No sudden chatter. No running footsteps in the halls. Even the youngest moved carefully, as if the floor might remember them. Breakfast passed in near silence, spoons clinking too loudly against bowls. Caretakers exchanged glances. Bad dreams, one of them murmured. Sister Agnes said nothing. She had not slept. She sat at the far end of the dining hall, hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea, eyes studying the children one by one. She was searching for something she could not name, but when her gaze landed on Thomas, her grip tightened. He was different, not sick, not afraid, aware. Thomas ate slowly, thoughtfully, as if listening to something beneath the sound of the room. When another child dropped a spoon and flinched at the noise, Thomas looked toward the hallway instinctively, toward the place where shadows gathered even in daylight. Sister Agnes stood abruptly. Thomas, she said gently, walk with me. The boy rose without protest. They moved down the corridor toward her office, footsteps echoing softly. As the door closed behind them, the orphanage seemed to exhale. Sister Agnes knelt in front of him, searching his face. Did you see something last night? Thomas considered lying. He chose not to. Yes, he said. Her breath caught. A dream? No. Silence stretched. Did it speak to you? She asked. Yes. Sister Agnes closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were wet. Did it touch you? Thomas shook his head. No. Did it take anything from you? No. The relief that washed over her was immediate, but incomplete. What did it leave? She whispered. Thomas hesitated. He did not have words for it yet. Not fully. It showed me, he said finally, how the dark listens. Sister Agnes stiffened. That is not something a child should know. I think I was supposed to, Thomas replied. She stood slowly, unsettled in a way prayer could not ease. You must not talk about this, she said firmly. To anyone. Thomas nodded, but the promise felt fragile. That afternoon, strange things began to happen. A window no one could open slid up easily for Thomas when he leaned against it. A door that had been stuck for years swung inward when he passed. In the courtyard, shadows gathered near him even when the sun stood high. The other children noticed. They sat closer to him at meals. They followed him in the yard. When fear rose, small fears, childish fears, they looked at Thomas without knowing why. He did not like it. That night, as the orphanage settled into uneasy sleep, Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He felt it again. Not pressure, recognition. The shadows in the corner of the room deepened. Dracula did not emerge fully. He did not need to. You are changed, his voice whispered, threading through the dark. Thomas sat up slowly. You said you wouldn't take anything. I didn't, Dracula replied. You offered it. What did I offer? Attention. Thomas swallowed. Can you take it back? A pause. No. The honesty was heavier than cruelty. Am I in danger? Thomas asked. Dracula's eyes opened in the darkness, distant, controlled. Not from me. That doesn't make me feel better. Dracula's gaze softened. It should. He moved closer, shadows bending toward him. You see now how thin the world is, he said. Most never notice. That is a burden and a shield. I don't want people to look at me like this, Thomas said quietly. Like I'm different. Difference is not something you choose, Dracula replied. Only how you carry it. Will they come? Thomas asked. The others you didn't name. Dracula was silent for a long moment. Some already have, he said. Thomas's heart raced. Then why are you still here? Dracula leaned closer to the edge of bed, his presence heavy but contained. Because once you are seen by the night, he said, someone must watch back. Thomas understood then. Dracula was not haunting the orphanage anymore. He was guarding it. And as the shadows settled into uneasy stillness, Thomas realized a truth no one else could yet see. The eighth night had not ended the watching. It had only changed who was being watched and why. The orphanage stopped feeling empty after dark. Not fuller, just occupied. Thomas noticed it first in the hours before sleep, when the building settled and ordinary sounds faded. The silence was no longer hollow. It carried weight, like a held breath that did not belong to the children or the caretakers. Something lingered. Not Dracula. Something else. The other children sensed it too. Nightmares returned, but they were different now. Less chaotic, more precise. Dreams of hallways that bent the wrong way. Of whispers that spoke without sound. Of corners that felt too deep to be shadows. They gathered around Thomas the next day, without planning to. Can you make it stop? A girl asked him in a voice barely louder than air. Thomas shook his head. I don't make anything. But it listens to you, another child said. We can tell. Thomas wanted to deny it. He wanted to be ordinary again, to blend back into the quiet background of the orphanage. But when a door slammed down the hall for no reason, every head turned toward him instinctively. That night, the moon did not rise fully. Clouds pressed low and heavy, smothering the sky. The courtyard lay in half-light, the trees beyond it bending toward the building as if curious. Thomas lay awake, counting breaths, when the cold returned, not sharp, not sudden, intentional. The shadows in the room shifted, gathering near the walls instead of the bed. That alone told him something was wrong. Dracula, he whispered. No answer. The temperature dropped further. The dark along the ceiling rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. Then came the sound. Not footsteps. Scraping. Slow. Careful. Testing the limits of the space. Thomas sat up. The shadows peeled away from the wall, stretching too far, thinning into shapes that suggested limbs but never settled into them. Pale eyes opened within the darkness. More than two. They did not glow. They watched. Marked child, the presence murmured, the words forming directly in Thomas's mind. You are bright in a way the night notices. Thomas's heart hammered. Go away. The shapes shifted closer. You were seen, they continued. That makes you an invitation. No, Thomas said louder now. I didn't invite you. The night did. The darkness leaned inward, crowding the room, swallowing the edges of the beds where other children slept unaware. Thomas felt the pressure build, heavier than fear, heavier than sound. Then the shadows snapped back. The room seemed to fold inward on itself as Dracula peered, not emerging but asserting. The darkness recoiled instinctively, like animals recognizing a larger predator. Leave, Dracula commanded. The pale eyes hesitated. You do not own him. They whispered. Dracula stepped forward, his presence anchoring the room. I guard what I mark, he said. That is older than ownership. The shadows wavered. He shines too brightly, they pressed. He will draw others. Dracula's gaze flicked to Thomas, not in anger, but in something like regret. Then he must learn to dim, Dracula replied. The darkness withdrew, retreating into corners, into cracks, into places the light never fully reached. Silence fell, real silence, Thomas's legs shook. You said they were already here. Dracula turned to him. I said some had come. Will they come back? Dracula nodded once. Yes. Because of me? Because you are visible, Dracula corrected. That is not a crime. Thomas hugged his knees. I don't want this. Dracula crouched beside the bed. One has little power over attention, he said. But discipline does. What I do, you stop listening when the night flatters you, Dracula said. You do not answer curiosity with curiosity. And you never step toward the dark just because it calls you special. Thomas swallowed hard. And if I fail? Dracula's eyes softened. Then I will still be here. That comfort frightened Thomas more than the darkness had. Why? He asked. Why me? Dracula stood slowly. Because you were not chosen for weakness, he said. You were noticed for restraint. He faded back into shadow, leaving the room unchanged but not unguarded. Thomas lay back down, staring at the ceiling. He understood now. The night was not a place. It was a crowd. And once it learned your name, you had to choose, every single night, who you allowed to answer back. The final night did not announce itself. There was no gathering storm, no unnatural silence pressing against the walls. The orphanage moved through its evening routine as if nothing waited beyond the windows. Dinner was served. Prayers were whispered. Lights were dimmed. But Thomas felt it. Not danger. Decision. He lay awake long after the others slept, listening to the building breathe. The shadows behaved themselves now, holding their shapes, respecting corners and edges. It was almost peaceful, almost, until the space beneath the ceiling grew heavier. Dracula appeared without drama, stepping from darkness as if he had always belonged to the room. His presence steadied the air, drew lines where there had been none. Tonight end something, he said. Thomas sat up. For me? For the orphanage, Dracula replied. And for what follows you? Thomas's chest tightened. You said they'd keep coming. They will, Dracula said calmly. But not here. A sound rose beyond the walls, a low, restless stirring that had no voice and no form. The night gathering itself elsewhere, disappointed. Thomas swallowed. What do I have to do? Dracula regarded him with something close to respect. Nothing extraordinary, he said. Only what you have already learned. They moved quietly through the halls, past sleeping children and flickering candles. The building seemed to lean away from them, not in fear, but in deference. At the front doors, Dracula stopped. This place will forget me, he said. It will remember you. Thomas nodded. I don't want to be special. Dracula's mouth curved faintly. Neither did I. He opened the door. Cold air rushed in, not hostile, not welcoming. Honest. Beyond the courtyard, the trees shifted, their shadows layered and deep. Pale shapes watched from the edge of perception. Careful now. Thomas stepped forward, heart steady. I won't follow, he said aloud, to the night itself. I won't answer. The shapes recoiled slightly as if surprised. Dracula watched closely. I know you're there, Thomas continued, but you don't get to decide who I become. The night pressed closer, testing. Thomas stood his ground. Nothing answered. Slowly, reluctantly, the presence withdrew. Not defeated, dismissed. Dracula closed the door. The orphanage exhaled. It is done, he said. Thomas turned to him. What happens now? Dracula's gaze softened. Now you live, he replied. Quietly, carefully. Will you stay? Dracula shook his head. My watching ends here. The truth stung more than Thomas expected. Because they're gone? Because you no longer need a shadow to stand between you and the dark, Dracula said. You learn to refuse it yourself. They stood in silence for a moment, two figures shaped by night, one ancient, one just beginning. Will you forget me? Thomas asked. Dracula considered the question seriously. I forget many things, he said, but never restraint. He stepped back into the shadow, his form thinning, unraveling. Before he vanished completely, he left Thomas with one final truth. The night always looks for witnesses, he said. Very few learn how not to testify. And then he was gone. Morning came. Sunlight filled the halls. Laughter returned. The orphanage felt lighter, as if something had been gently unhooked from its foundation. Thomas woke like everyone else. Years passed. He grew. He left. He lived an ordinary life by careful choice. He never chased mysteries, never leaned too close to the dark. When fear whispered, he listened, then let it pass. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, he would glance at shadows out of habit. They never answered. But far away, where the world still forgot how thin it was, something ancient watched. Not with hunger, not with claim, with approval, because the night had learned something rare. Some children are not taken. Some are taught. And some, once seen, learn how to look back and say no.